G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe.
Introducing the new G.I. Joe Adventure Team. 5 rugged men.
Nobody beats G.I. Joe, a real American hero! Nobody beats G.I. Joe! Yo, Joe! Got to get tough! Yo, Joe! G.I. Joe!
It takes a special type of franchise to stay around as long as G.I. Joe has. Yes, its level of relevance has shifted up and down over the years, but its roots date all the way back to 1964 when it debuted as a culturally iconic 12-inch scaled military toy, before eventually evolving into the adventuring concept of the 1970s, as well as a short-lived sci-fi themed Super Joe toy line in the late 1970s. But the series largely being covered on Toy Connections is that of the smaller 3 3/4 inch scaled G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero toy line. It's a brand that famously ran from 1982 until 1994 and featured characters that would be revered by fans even decades after their initial release. That said, while 1994 would represent the 30th anniversary of the franchise as a whole, the year also marked the end of an era, as the last chapter in what many consider the strongest continual run in G.I. Joe's history. And it's interesting that such a symbolic year could mark both celebration as well as a level of sadness for such a quintessential toy line. I do have mixed feelings about this particular subject because it does take us to the end of this history series. That said, it is a necessary part of the story, so let's have a look at the final year of the vintage G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero run. There's really a lot to talk about when it comes to G.I. Joe in 1994, and the story wouldn't be complete without acknowledging the other changes occurring in and around the toy industry, and in particular, Hasbro as a toy company at this point. Now, I'm not sure that everyone has an understanding as to what was going on at Hasbro's Rhode Island office around this time, so what we need to do is have a discussion about the most significant week for G.I. Joe during 1994. After so many years on the front lines for Hasbro, much of G.I. Joe's dissolution during this era can be attributed to a fateful day on Tuesday, August 16th, 1994. Infamously, it would come to be known by those who experienced it as Black Tuesday. G. Wayne Miller's Toy Wars book goes into detail about some of the inner workings at Hasbro during this period. Much of the staff who worked on G.I. Joe would be let go during this time, which was a cost savings and internal consolidation measure. G.I. Joe's further development after 1994 would occur at the Cincinnati office where Hasbro's Kenner division was located. As a quick reminder, Hasbro obtained Kenner as part of a larger deal when they purchased Tonka in 1991, and Tonka had previously acquired Kenner back in 1987. And those who did manage to stay employed at Hasbro would get moved to different aspects of the business. For example, former G.I. Joe product manager and vice president of Boys Toys, Kirk Bazigian, would be moved over to work on Play-Doh. Others, like designer Greg Berntsen, known for his work on the epic USS Flag, would move over to work on Play School. But it seems that the decision to end the G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero 3 3/4 inch line occurred well before Black Tuesday. As mentioned in an Articulated Points YouTube video from 2023, Patrick Stewart flips through the 1994 G.I. Joe convention issue of the Action Figure News and Toy Review magazine. Here, he notes that some of the article writers were at Hasbro's office in July of 1994, and the decision to end the line had already been made by the time of this visit. But getting back to the week of Black Tuesday in August, 3 days later, on Friday, August 19th, 1994, there was a Christie's East auction to sell off many remaining G.I. Joe items in Hasbro's archive, some of which were things in development for potential use down the line or things used in the past that they no longer needed. Again, I'll thank Patrick Stewart for sending me a PDF copy of this auction, and one interesting thing that I noticed was that the price realized for certain items sold was often lower than the predicted value. But of course, this was way back in 1994, and such scarce items might go for much more had the collector's market back then been what it is in modern times. That said, some items did go for quite the high price. Timing-wise, strangely, Black Tuesday was also just days before the 1994 G.I. Joe International Collectors Convention, which occurred on Saturday, August 20th and Sunday, August 21st. This took place at the legendary USS Intrepid, which of course was a World War II aircraft carrier that was converted into a museum in New York. Thus, it was something of a bittersweet experience because, on one hand, it was the 30th anniversary salute for G.I. Joe as an overall brand, but at the same time, it represented the end of something historic, as the G.I. Joe A Real American Hero toy line was now a casualty of the shifting times in the toy industry. It seemed that G.I. Joe had tried to be all things to all people, what with all the differing concepts introduced during its run, and it may have been a little too much. Such was admitted by Hasbro CEO Alan Hassenfeld at the time in a quote found in Miller's Toy Wars. Action figures were shifting larger in size, and by 1994, there were more and more things to take away the attention of a child who may have grown up with G.I. Joe. For me personally, I spent 1994 glued to the television screen as Mighty Morphin Power Rangers transitioned between its first and second seasons, which included a change in Zords, toys of which that I asked for that Christmas. And of course, there was the entire mystery surrounding the introduction and identity of the White Ranger. Additionally, during this year, I also found myself distracted that June by an epic Stanley Cup Playoff Finals series. The grunge music scene took a major turn with the death of Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain that spring, and this 1994 year was also the time of the highly covered O.J. Simpson manhunt over the murder charges that eventually led to his later trial. So as can be seen, 1994 was quite the eventful calendar year. But back to the toy front, 1994 was also a year in which Hasbro rival Mattel actually outsold Hasbro, even if Hasbro had enjoyed success over Mattel prior to this. Mattel had upped its sales to $3.2 billion this year, while Hasbro had dipped slightly to $2.67 billion. Note that both companies were just north of $2.7 billion in 1993, with Hasbro having just barely edged out Mattel that previous year. So perhaps it was indeed time for change at Hasbro. Now, even through all this, and with that crazy week between Black Tuesday on August 16th and the Christie's auction and G.I. Joe convention that occurred in the days after, it's important to note that the G.I. Joe legacy was honored in many ways with its 1994 30th anniversary. The anniversary figures included a very special character, listed simply as G.I. Joe, but really, he was Joseph Colton, the first and original G.I. Joe who would lead an ultimate freedom fighting force. The figure was released both as a bag mail-away as well as being a boxed convention exclusive. Colton wears some gear akin to the taller 1960s Joes, in particular the beret and scarf from the 1966 Green Beret. And on the topic of 12-inch tall Joes, while the scope of the 12-inch 1990s Hall of Fame line goes beyond what this history series covers, I personally find it important to note that Joe Colton was also honored with a 1994 mail-in figure in this scale as well. The character of Joe Colton was again revisited during the Marvel Comics G.I. Joe run in 1994. Specifically, Colton would be called back to active duty at the end of issue 151. Then, in issue 152, he recalls a mission during his days in Vietnam. Later that issue, he tells how he was called into the Oval Office, where President Kennedy assigns Colton to command a new team, handing him a folder with the name G.I. Joe on it. It's also worth noting that Joe Colton's name comes from that of Kirk Bozigian's son, whose name is Colton. For other figures commemorating this anniversary year, we have the Action Soldier, who very much is another callback to the original Action Soldier of the 1960s and the gear that you could outfit him with. Likewise, here's the Action Marine, another figure commemorating the original, larger line of G.I. Joe from the previous era. Similarly, we have the Action Sailor, representing yet another classic. And then here's the Action Pilot. As such, these four 3 3/4 inch representations were introduced to commemorate the earliest releases of G.I. Joe back in 1964. On that note though, these figures were also released as part of an original Action Team boxed set, but for this release, the Action Sailor came in an orange color and the Action Pilot came decked out in blue. Then there's the Action Pilot Astronaut, which was specifically included with the original Action Team set, not having his own individual anniversary release like the other 4 figures. And included in the Action Team boxed set was an Action Space capsule. There was also the convention-exclusive fighter pilot and parachute, and the parachute came in some different variant colors. Here's the special box that came with this fighter pilot. For the main figure line, you'll notice 2 different styles of logo. First is the more traditional horizontal logo, but 1994 was also the year that Hasbro elected to make a change to the vertical style logo. This logo also adds a thicker black outline compared to the previous version, and quite notably, some figures got released on both styles of packaging, while some only got one or the other. This also resulted in 2 different styles of file cards being made at times. For this year, Hasbro produced figures both in China as well as Indonesia. As such, you'd see variations to some figures. Going over a few examples, you see a dial tone variant here with some green paint applications on the sides of the torso and one that does not have these extra paint applications. Stalker has a variant with yellow details on the sides of the torso, and Star Brigade Roadblock also has a variant with black chest details with another that has silver details. Looking at the main line of Battle Corps figures, the heroic side had the aforementioned dial tone as well as Stalker in their lineup. Our favorite warrant officer, Flint, was also back, as was the team's ranger, Beachhead. The rescue trooper, Lifeline, was also here, as was another version of Snowstorm. We have the somewhat humorously named Ice Cream Soldier, though his name seems to be derived directly from the Sergeant Rock character from DC Comics. The Navy SEAL, fan favorite, Shipwreck, also got a figure this year. And the heroes also got this version of Windchill, who came packed in with the vehicle known as the Blockbuster. The Blockbuster's main feature was its double-barreled pom-pom cannon. The G.I. Joe Battle Corps also got the Manta Ray as a vehicle. And then there was the string-traveling Razor Blade, a unique vehicle for which, during the development process, designer Bill Young said that he was inspired by Mattel's Hot Birds line. And additionally, he wished he could have done the Razor Blade in metal to give it more weight to travel faster along the string. The Cobra Battle Corps got this revised version of the mercenary Major Blood, and joining him was the anti-tank specialist, Metalhead. And here's the Night Creeper leader also returning with new colors. And for army builders, we got this revised version of the standard infantry, the Cobra Viper. And then there was another release of the Urban Assault Trooper, namely the Alley Viper. For vehicles, the Cobra Battle Corps got the Scorpion, which came both in a tan body variant that had black weapons and a variant that had this color scheme reversed. Star Brigade was back this year, and we got a release of Duke to lead the Joe ranks. Joining him, we have Countdown and an explosives expert named Effects. We also got Ozone, who's now got 3 versions within Star Brigade when you include his 2 1993 appearances. Similarly, Payload got a version this year where he's mostly decked out in black, and another where he's mostly wearing white, thus giving him 3 versions as well when you include the 1993 release. I've already mentioned Roadblock earlier when I was talking about examples for certain variants. Here's Sci-Fi, now advertised as a Star Brigade pilot, and then we have another pilot by the name of Space Shot. Here's Gears, along with his Star Brigade Power Fighter, which serves as a one-man attack unit similar to what the Exo Squad line was doing in the 1990s. Cobra got their Power Fighter too, and this one has a few different variants in terms of weapon colors and color detailing on the fighter body. It came with a Techno Viper, who's mostly found in the color scheme shown here with the copper detailing on his body. That said, some much rarer versions with the yellow detailing as shown on the box photography here have also leaked into the collector's market. It is possible though that the yellow detailed versions are pre-production samples that were not intended for retail. Here we have a version of Cobra Commander to lead the villain side for Star Brigade, and then Cobra had an elite space pilot known as the Cobra Black Star. The Star Brigade subset also expanded to include the strange Lunartix Empire. Such alien creatures included Predacon, who designer Kurt Groen has stated that he drew inspiration from both the Aliens as well as Predator movie franchises. The Lunartix Empire also included the alien destroyer known as Carcass and an explorer known as Lobotomax. With the perpetual inclusion of ninjas in the G.I. Joe line, the Shadow Ninjas subset represented the next evolution of the theme. The figures were made of translucent plastic and could switch between a translucent look and a colored look when exposed to water. Note that much like the regularly carded Star Brigade figures of 1993, the Shadow Ninjas reused card art across each figure. The villain side included the Night Creeper and the Cobra Swordsman known as Slice. The heroic side had Bushido as well as Nunchuck. Storm Shadow is a natural choice to fit into this grouping. And of course, we had Snake Eyes. Snake Eyes had a significant part in the final issue of the original G.I. Joe Marvel Comics run. This issue, numbered 155, would see the disbandment of the G.I. Joe team. But also, a young boy named Sean Collins, who's the son of a previous Cobra Crimson guardsman, would write a letter to Snake Eyes to seek his advice about joining the military. In that last issue, Snake Eyes would take the time and write back to Sean. And then years later, when Devil's Due Publishing picked up the rights to create G.I. Joe comics in the early 2000s, author and company founder Josh Blaylock would write Sean Collins in as the apprentice of Snake Eyes. Taking the name Kamakura, he'd become an important part of G.I. Joe lore thereafter. So while the 1994 year signified the end of a very memorable era, it's worth pointing out that with the line's conclusion midway through the year, that not every item planned for 1994 got released. For example, the Star Brigade Manimals were set for late 1994, and the Ninja Commandos were also slated for this period. That said, neither made it to retail. Of note, however, and even before G.I. Joe's transition away from the Hasbro offices in Rhode Island to the Kenner offices in Cincinnati, Hasbro had actually already developed something for release.
Sgt Savage is the biggest, baddest soldier ever to join the G.I. Joe team.
The G.I. Joe line known as Sgt Savage and his Screaming Eagles was introduced, and contrary to common belief, it was initially conceived as something to run in parallel with the existing as well as other upcoming G.I. Joe brand segments, many of which we've talked about in this video. Thus, Sgt Savage wasn't actually intended to be a replacement to the G.I. Joe 82 to 94 line, even if it sort of ended up that way. Development material for Sgt Savage, as presented by Patrick from Articulated Points, shows dates from prior to the end of the 3 3/4 inch line, with some documentation dating back as far as early 1993. With this context in mind, it may be more accurate to say that the Sgt Savage series was actually the last segment of the G.I. Joe A Real American Hero line that was allowed to survive and continue past the end of the 3 3/4 inch scaled line, with the intention of carrying G.I. Joe into 1995. That said, it became publicly known at the August 1994 G.I. Joe convention at the USS Intrepid that the G.I. Joe line as we knew it was ending, and it was here that Sgt Savage was unveiled to the public. However, Sgt Savage did maintain the Real American Hero branding on its packaging, even if it was a larger figure than the Joes that preceded it, sizing up to the other action figures that were on the market at the time. And thus, they looked a little different than the G.I. Joe that we knew. Now, despite many fans considering Sgt Savage as being something entirely different, it did have ties to the previous Joes. This was clear by the fact that the Sgt Savage cartoon included General Hawk, Lady J, Doc, and Cobra Commander, in addition to Sgt Savage and his Screaming Eagles. But unfortunately, Sgt Savage would be short-lived, and Kenner wanted to make its own mark on the G.I. Joe world. They'd do this by starting development of their G.I. Joe Extreme line even before 1994 was over, thus never really giving Sgt Savage a chance to get a foothold in the action figure market for 1995. Additionally, we'd see Street Fighter movie figures co-branded with the late 1994 film. While using the G.I. Joe style of body construction, they were not co-branded with G.I. Joe, unlike the 1993 Street Fighter II figures. The G.I. Joe stylized Mortal Kombat figures were also not branded as being part of G.I. Joe. That said, they're still worth a mention here. Thus, if we could look back at the 1990s for Hasbro, it was a time of change and shifting interests in the toy industry. There were both ups and downs. In addition to everything we already said, Hasbro would make investments like the sliced bread project, which was planned to be something of a head-mounted virtual reality console that could compete with Nintendo and Sega. Though after spending tens of millions of dollars in investment and development money, it would never come to fruition. There were even serious talks about Mattel and Hasbro merging into one company during this era, with Mattel being the more interested party in such a colossal industry move. That said, Hasbro CEO Alan Hassenfeld stuck to his guns, and the companies remained separate. Ultimately though, that takes us to the end of this G.I. Joe 1982 to 1994 Toy History series, and it's been a pleasure for me to make time and take that stroll down memory lane to both research as well as present this information to all of you. While it is a bit sad for me to conclude this particular year-by-year history series, and also a bit sad to look back at how such a great toy line drew to a close in 1994, it's still great to know that G.I. Joe has maintained a legacy amongst its fans over the many years since. But if anything, all the time spent playing with G.I. Joe as a kid, then researching, plus collecting, as well as spending time with fellow collectors that became friends later on, has all been worth it for me. And hopefully, you've learned something from watching these videos. Because as they say, knowing is half the battle.
And knowing is half the battle.
And if you enjoy toy histories as much as I do, you're going to want to have a look at this other 1990s G.I. Joe video by clicking right over here, or to learn about one of Hasbro's lesser known toy lines, have a look at this video right over here. And with that, yo Joe, and I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for watching, and take care.